Hey guys, tonight we step softly into a palace corridor where the lamps are dim and every sound seems to fold into silence. The banners above you shift as if stirred by breath you cannot hear, and in that hush, whispers once guided emperors. Not the booming voices of generals, not the elaborate petitions of ministers, but the quiet direction of men, with compasses and scrolls. You probably won't survive the silence of these halls without imagining something moving just beyond the lantern light, because here, silence was never empty. It was a presence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you shared your location and the time where you are listening. Midnight in Toronto, early morning in Sydney, maybe a lazy afternoon in Buenos Aires. Together, we make a constellation of little lanterns across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The silence of an imperial palace is unlike any other. It is not simple quiet, the kind you find on a countryside road. It is dense, layered, a silence stitched together by centuries of ritual. Stone floors polished by countless sandals seem to echo even when no one passes. The air itself feels trained to wait, as though every breath is measured. Courtiers bow low, robes brushing the ground, but they do not speak until spoken to. And in that restraint, in that constant holding back of sound, lies a power more commanding than any roar. You and I can almost picture the boy who first walked these halls, drawn into their vastness, his own footsteps too loud to his ears. He would learn quickly that here, hesitation was wisdom and pause was policy. A monarch in training did not need to know every word, but he needed to know when not to speak. The palace trained rulers not only in governance, but in silence, teaching them that the weight of an empire could be carried more in what was unsaid than in what was declared. Imagine lanterns placed along a gallery, their glow soft against carved dragons. Each flame is small, but together they hold the darkness back. This is how the empire functioned in its best days, each minister, each official, a small flame keeping the night at bay. But the silence between them was always ready to return. And when silence grew too thick, when no voice dared to rise above the hush, shadows lengthened. Emperors who mistook that hush for harmony discovered too late that it was really fear. You might ask, how could a single person command so much quiet? Part of it was ceremony. Ministers approached in order, their robes heavy, their words rehearsed. Eunuchs signaled when to kneel, when to rise. The emperor's slightest gesture carried across the hall like a gong. But part of it was deeper. This culture of silence shaped the very rhythm of power. A pause between two words could mean approval, or it could mean doom. Courtiers spent years learning to read those pauses, while emperors learned to wield them like blades. Yet silence was also a veil. Behind it, indulgence crept in unnoticed. A ruler who turned his face away from reports could bury an empire's suffering under layers of quiet. Fields might wither, soldiers might starve. Yet if the court remained still, no petitions raised, no voices trembling, then the emperor could believe all was well. In this way, silence became not just presence, but deception. Picture a banquet hall where music fades and the dancers withdraw, leaving only the emperor in his seat, gazing into the shadows. The silence afterward could feel eternal, a silence that whispered, "You are the center, you are the axis of heaven and earth," and many believed it. Emperors came to mistake the hush for reverence, when sometimes it was simply exhaustion, the court too weary or too frightened to break the stillness. It is easy, under such conditions, to drift, to imagine that governance is as effortless as raising a cup, that harmony will flow as long as you maintain the ritual. But dynasties were not lost to thunder alone. They were undone by sighs, by muffled complaints, by the soft withdrawal of loyalty hidden beneath silence. This is why silence in a palace is never just absence. It is the stage on which history tilts. As we stand here together in this quiet, you and I sense the dual nature of it. Silence can steady, but it can also suffocate. It can preserve order, but it can also conceal decay. And in the story of emperors remembered as disasters, silence was often their most dangerous companion. They listened only to the quiet, never to the cries just beyond the lantern light. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. The hush of the palace has a way of bending childhood. Imagine being no older than the children you might see running through a park today. Yet every garment you wear weighs like a curtain, every step rehearsed on polished stone. Hey guys, Tonight we step with him the boy destined to become Emperor Rinto corridors that trained him long before he could truly understand their weight. Tutors surrounded him with bamboo slips and scrolls, voices weaving tales of balance between heaven and earth. He nodded, recited lines, copied characters, until his wrist ached, but even as his hand moved, his mind often slipped away. Beyond the lattice windows, blossoms drifted, carried by wind like small dancers. From the gardens came faint music flutes, zithers, the laughter of attendants at play. You and I can almost see him turning his face toward those sounds, longing for a world less heavy than the one mapped onto his shoulders. The robes themselves were lessons, layers of silk pressed down on his frame, colors reserved only for royalty. They reminded him daily that he was not simply a boy, he was the center around which rituals turned, but inside, he still was a boy curious, easily distracted, enchanted by rhythm and spectacle more than dry reports of tax grain or border patrols. Ministers whispered that indulgence had already found him, even before his crown. Concubines in waiting, chosen from noble families, watched closely. They noticed his gaze lingered longer on the tilt of a wine cup than on the brush of a pen. Eunuchs, expert readers of mood, learned that smiles earned them favor, while stern reminders earned them silence. A court adapts quickly. It began to feed him what he liked. More music, more ceremony, fewer hard truths. And in that gentle yielding, negligence became invisible. Picture one night in the study hall. He sat cloaked in silk too ornate for his years. A minister beside him reading aloud a report of grain shortages in the north. The words were measured, the tone grave. Yet through the open window, a flute note floated in, carried on the breeze. His head turned slightly. His eyes softened. He nodded politely, but the numbers fell like stones into a pond, never surfacing again. Later, when asked what he remembered, it was not famine or figures, it was that fleeting melody and the idle wondering of who had played it. You and I sense how fragile such foundations are. The crown came before maturity. Responsibility pressed down upon a spirit still chasing delight. He believed, perhaps innocently, that the empire was as forgiving as his tutors had been. Lessons postponed one day could always be caught up the next. But empires, unlike teachers, do not wait. Fields cannot delay their harvest. Soldiers cannot postpone their wages. Merchants cannot ignore broken roads. Patience exists, but only for a time. Inside the palace, adoration misled him. Attendants bowed so deeply their foreheads brushed the ground. They rose with rehearsed smiles, echoing his own, convincing him that harmony existed wherever he walked. He mistook that reflection for stability, unaware that beneath the surface, negligence repeated softly becomes its own form of harm. And as he grew, so too did his pleasures. Songs stretched longer into the night, games delayed the morning, and ministers learned not to press petitions too firmly. Each season that passed without his full attention was a season in which the empire shifted, unsteady, waiting for hands that did not quite close around it. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. The palace within the palace was the harem, a maze of chambers heavy with fragrance and soft laughter. To the emperor, still young enough to crave warmth and companionship, these rooms felt like refuge. Here, silk curtains moved with hidden breezes, and lanterns painted slow shadows across polished floors. Here, every smile seemed to promise devotion, and every voice arrived softened by poetry or song. At first, it felt harmless, even healing. Nights filled with music, dancers turning like petals in the air, poems recited in tones so delicate you might imagine they were lullabies. Concubines bent to pour his wine, eunuchs clapped at his remarks, and the emperor, though long pressed by the weight of ceremony, felt lighter than in any audience hall. He convinced himself that harmony in the harem must be proof of harmony in the empire. You and I can almost hear his sigh of relief as laughter replaced counsel, as music smothered the petitions left unread. But palaces of silk have sharper edges than their softness shows. Every bow was calculated. Every glance carried the ambitions of families who had placed their daughters here like seeds. A tear shed at the right time might bloom into policy. A whispered word at the right ear could reshape appointments. The emperor, intoxicated by comfort, began to confuse affection with loyalty, desire with stability. Picture with me a night among cushions and embroidered screens. Dancers move in slow circles, sleeves wide as waves. A favored consort leans close, her voice a murmur over the music, a complaint about a governor, a plea for her household. The emperor, softened by wine and attention, nods. By dawn, the governor is dismissed, and another connected to her family stands in his place. The empire tilts, not through reasoned debate, but through a whisper carried across a pillow. Ministers outside these walls knew. They saw decrees arrive without the weight of counsel, watched appointments drift toward factions favored by silk and perfume. They bowed lower, spoke softer, and disguised frustration as praise. To protest was not only risky, it was useless. Power no longer moved through the hall of governance but through chambers painted with cranes and phoenixes. The harem became more than a sanctuary. It became a council chamber of its own. Decisions once crafted through scrolls and arguments now emerged from laughter and subtle tears. The empire was steered not by deliberation but by presence, by the quiet negotiation of who sat nearest, whose hand lingered longest, whose sigh seemed deepest. And the rivalries deepened. A jealous look between concubines bloomed into suspicion. Suspicion grew into accusations whispered to eunuchs, passed along until they became rumors with sharp edges. The emperor, caught in webs of affection and intrigue, found it harder to know who was loyal, who was sincere, who only mirrored his reflection back at him. Meanwhile, beyond these perfumed corridors, farmers continued to plant, soldiers continued to wait for their pay, merchants traced cracks in roads that went unrepaired. Their burdens grew heavier, but the emperor mistook the devotion around him for devotion everywhere. He believed the empire would bend as willingly as his companions did, yield as gently to his desires. But you and I, standing in these silk-lined chambers, can sense the fracture. The music continues, the dances dazzle, but underneath, the empire shifts. Threads of silk tighten not just around a ruler's heart, but around the pillars of the dynasty itself. Nights that should end in decrees end instead in poetry. Days that should begin with audiences begin instead with silence. And so the empire, rich in fragrance and music, began to lose its rhythm. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. Beyond the scented chambers of the harem stood the grand audience hall, vast as a forest of pillars, its painted dragons and clouds gazing down from the beams above. Here, the empire was meant to find its voice. Ministers presenting reports, generals giving counsel, accountants tallying grain. Yet when the emperor took his seat, robes heavy and crown glinting, the air felt thinner than it once had. You and I can almost hear the change. Once, petitions were carried in boldly, words spoken with weight. Now, each voice trembled, wrapped in caution. A minister unrolled his scroll to speak of famine in the north, but he dared not sound urgent. He described the shortage as a seasonal trial, knowing that sharper words might offend. Another rose to warn of soldiers growing restless at unpaid wages. The emperor smiled faintly, as though such warnings were impolite, as though silence itself were harmony. Truth had grown cautious here. Words that once rang clear were now costumed in flattery. A costly project was praised as visionary, a rebellion called a passing breeze. Ministers who longed to speak plainly softened their tones, knowing bluntness could end careers or worse, summon indifference. Slowly, the great hall lost its voice. It became less a chamber of governance and more a stage, each man performing lines rehearsed to please one listener. Other figures moved in the shadows, filling the silence. Eunuchs, close to the emperor in his private hours, began to shape the rhythm of audiences. They decided who spoke first, who was delayed, whose petitions never arrived at all. Concubines, though absent from the hall, shaped outcomes as well. Words murmured in private chambers reappeared here, already polished into decrees. Ministers bowed to the emperor, but often they were bowing to voices they could not see. The mandate of heaven, once imagined as a single beam of light upon one throne, now refracted through silk curtains and hidden corridors. Decisions slowed, their reasoning blurred. A famine lingered longer than it should. A border force remained unpaid. A canal swallowed more labor than it yielded in harvest. Yet incense continued to burn. Ceremonies continued. And the emperor, calm and serene, mistook ritual for governance. Outside, dissonance grew sharper. Farmers grumbled as grain was taken for palaces and festivals. Soldiers in garrisons wondered why their pay arrived late while the capital glittered at night. Merchants dragged carts along crumbling roads even as marble halls were polished daily. Their voices had not yet reached the throne, but they swelled like water behind a dam, patient but heavy. Inside, the emperor sat serene, believing his stillness was reflected in the empire. He did not see that silence can conceal exhaustion, that bowed heads may lower from habit, not from reverence. The court, trained to flatter, sustained the illusion. Every nod of approval, every poem offered as advice, was another thread tying him tighter to unreality. The hall itself began to feel hollow. Dragons painted above seemed to float in emptiness. Footsteps echoed louder than truth. Governance had become a play performed for one audience member who no longer looked closely at the stage. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. There comes a moment in every reign when authority begins to feel less like inheritance and more like inevitability. For this emperor, that moment arrived quietly, in the pause between one decree and the next. He had grown accustomed to the weight of the throne, and now he mistook its heaviness for permanence. You and I can almost see him, seated high upon carved wood, believing not only that heaven's mandate had chosen him, but that heaven itself had folded into his will. At first, power glimmered with brilliance. Roads stretched across valleys like ribbons. Palaces rose like constellations scattered upon the earth. Canals bent rivers into obedience, as though nature itself existed to mirror his designs. Every gesture of his hand seemed answered by 1,000 laborers. Every word seemed echoed by ministers who bowed so low their foreheads touched the stone. In those moments, greatness felt not like aspiration, but fact. But power, mistaken for destiny, slips easily into illusion. Ministers discovered that their safety lay not in truth but in reflection. If he dreamed of monuments, they praised his vision. If he longed for festivals, they hailed his generosity. Applause hardened into policy, and soon every echo sounded like truth. Those who whispered caution found their voices trailing into silence. Those who brought accounts that displeased saw their warnings vanish, as though erased from parchment by invisible hands. The emperor, emboldened, demanded more. He travelled with entourages so vast that villages emptied themselves to serve him, leaving fields untended. He ordered canals widened, not for need, but for spectacle, to prove that earth and water bent before him. Festivals extended for weeks, the treasury bleeding coin as lanterns bloomed across the night sky. To him, these were confirmations that he commanded not only men but seasons, not only armies but stars. Picture one evening, the terrace lined with lamps stretching into the distance. Below, the city glowed like a vast constellation. He raised a cup to the heavens and felt certain he was their equal, if not their master. It was intoxicating, this sense that destiny itself pulsed with his heartbeat, but you and I can hear what he could not. That applause, repeated too often, thins into emptiness. That lanterns burning too brightly consume their own oil. The paradox deepened. The more he commanded, the less connected he became. Villagers struggled to meet his demands, yet their struggles never reached his ears. Soldiers lost faith as wages arrived late, but their doubts never crossed the polished floors of his hall. Ministers trimmed their words until nothing remained but flattery. The empire moved, but its movements no longer matched its needs. Still, he believed rivers would carve themselves at his order, that stars would shine longer at his glance, that the silence of his court was reverence rather than fatigue. In that belief, power ceased to be stewardship and became theatre, and like all theatre, it required constant applause to sustain itself. You and I can sense the fragility beneath the grandeur. Roads stretched, but fields weakened. Palaces gleamed, but granaries emptied. Paradise delighted the capital, but left borders unguarded. He looked outward and saw eternity. We look closer and see stone beginning to loosen beneath his feet. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. At the crest of his reign, the empire glittered as though heaven itself had scattered its stars upon the earth. Everywhere he travelled, the world arranged itself into ceremony. Villagers knelt by dusty roads, foreheads pressed against the ground. Eunuchs hurried ahead to scatter petals. Musicians lifted flutes to the air so that silence could never linger. At night, lanterns bloomed across entire cities, until darkness itself seemed banished. To the emperor, this was devotion. To those who lived it, it was exhaustion painted as glory. You and I can almost hear the contradiction. Every lantern lit drained oil from a household. Every banquet that spilled into dawn emptied granaries faster than fields could fill them. Every canal that widened consumed hands that might have sown rice. The empire's applause concealed its hunger, yet the emperor drank it like nectar. He saw loyalty where there was only weariness, harmony where there was only habit. Inside the palace walls, splendor grew unchecked. Marble gleamed under constant polishing. Bronze drums thundered for processions that stretched for days. Palaces rose like forests of carved beams, lacquered so richly that their surfaces shone like water. Banquets layered dish upon dish, wines upon wines, until the air itself was heavy with perfume. Ministers praised it as heaven's favor, and poets compared it to eternal spring. But the spring was only on parchment. Outside, the fields grew thin. Imagine one terrace at night. The emperor stands with a cup raised to the stars. Below him, the capital glows, rivers glistening like silver threads, lanterns shimmering like galaxies. He believes this light proves destiny's blessing, that eternity has taken form in his reign. It is breathtaking. Yes, but light this bright always casts deeper shadows. You and I can sense them at the edges of the glow. Villagers drained, soldiers unpaid, families whispering of burdens heavier than they can bear. Ministers wrapped even disasters in poetry. A famine was called a test of endurance. Rebellion was softened into local unrest. The emperor, smiling faintly, accepted these disguises as truth. Calmness became his measure of success. Yet calmness, in this case, was only silence purchased at the cost of honesty. The hall echoed with flattery until flattery itself felt like reality. Beyond the city walls, patience thinned. Farmers muttered over meager harvests taken for taxes. Soldiers grumbled in tents, their armor rusting, their wages delayed. Merchants traced the cracks in crumbling roads, wondering how long goods could reach the capital. But in the palace, music drowned these murmurs, and the emperor believed applause was endless. This was splendor too bright to last. The empire's body, stretched thin, trembled beneath the weight of its own glitter. Grandeur had become accusation. What shone as proof of heaven's mandate by day became whispers of its withdrawal by night. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. The glow of lanterns faded, but the burdens they left behind did not. In villages far from the capital, the truth could no longer be disguised by poetry or parades. Fields left untended for conscripted labor grew patchy. Families sold heirlooms to buy grain. At night, the hearth's fire burned lower, and around it the stories changed. Children once heard tales of heroic emperors. Now they listened to laments of rulers who feasted while their people starved. You and I can almost hear those sighs, heavier than thunder, slipping through the countryside. Soldiers, too, felt the weight. Their wages arrived late, if at all. Armor rusted, weapons dulled. Instead of standing guard at the borders, they were called to march in parades designed to dazzle envoys. In their camps, whispers moved faster than orders, questions about whether heaven had turned its back, whether loyalty had been wasted on a court deaf to their hunger. An empire does not collapse in a single blow. It loosens first in hesitation, and hesitation now filled the ranks. Meanwhile, in the palace, the emperor paced long corridors lined with incense smoke. Banquets had grown smaller, the courtiers fewer, their smiles more strained. Even the music, once enough to erase his unease, now lingered uneasily, its notes hanging like smoke that refused to clear. He remembered, dimly, warnings offered years before, words he had dismissed as too harsh. For a heartbeat he wondered if those voices had been right, but the thought passed quickly. Drowned in another performance, another cup, another night of distraction. The very symbols of his greatness turned against him. Canals silted, palaces drained coin, feasts mocked the hunger outside their walls. Grandeur became accusation. What had been proof of heaven's favor now felt like evidence of its withdrawal. And yet he clung to illusion, for to admit the truth would be to admit that even the Son of Heaven could be abandoned. Among the people, omens gained power. An eclipse became judgment, a flood punishment, a comet heaven's handwriting against the sky. Fear grew into anger, anger into quiet defiance. Farmers hid grain, soldiers shirked orders, ministers whispered succession behind closed doors. The empire did not bend anymore. It resisted, silently at first, then with cracks that no silence could seal. And you and I can feel it, walking through these dimmed halls. The palace still burns incense. The ceremonies still unfold, but another sound seeps beneath the rituals, the weary breath of a people no longer willing to carry so much. The decline does not roar. It sighs through empty granaries, through silent barracks, through bowed heads that no longer lower out of reverence, but out of habit. And yet, behind the stillness, Something gentle was beginning to shift. When the banquets ended and the lanterns dimmed for the last time, what remained was not applause but echo. The emperor, once surrounded by music and silk, passed into memory. Yet the memory did not fade as quickly as the perfume of a feast. It lingered, sometimes whispered in chronicles, sometimes muttered at village firesides, sometimes carried as warnings in the hearts of ministers who had survived his reign. You and I can almost hear those shadows still breathing in the corridors, long after the throne stood empty. The official records were careful. Historians seldom dared to write that an emperor was disaster. Instead, they chose words like extravagant, distracted, or misguided. But between the brushstrokes, the verdict was clear. Monuments gleamed, while fields starved. Canals consumed labor but yielded little. Festivals devoured coin as villagers bent under debt. The ink was polite, but the truth seeped through, like water darkening silk. For the people, the memory was sharper. Around hearths, elders told stories of a ruler who loved wine more than harvests, who listened longer to songs than to soldiers, who mistook heaven's silence for approval. These tales were not comfort, they were cautions. Children learned that a dynasty could collapse not by invasion alone but by indulgence, not by thunder but by sighs. Ministers who lived through the court carried their scars forward. They remembered how honesty had turned to danger, how flattery had become the only safe tongue. When they served the next emperor, some counseled more boldly, invoking the ghost of decline as a warning. Others stayed cautious, fearing truth might again be treated as rebellion. In this way, the shadow of one ruler shaped the behavior of those who followed, long after his music had gone silent. And the empire itself bore marks. Soil pressed harder than before, treasuries thinner, armies less certain of their loyalty, borders less guarded. Decline, once begun, seldom ends with one life. It ripples outward, touching generations not yet born. Yet even in failure, there was humanity. The emperor remembered as disaster had once been a child in gardens, dazzled by blossoms, later a youth enchanted by music, a man searching for affection and mistaking it for destiny. His tragedy was not that he wanted beauty or comfort, but that he believed beauty and comfort could carry the weight of a throne. You and I, standing in these shadowed halls, sense the paradox. Even disasters leave behind lessons. Grandeur without grounding becomes emptiness. Silence in court breeds silence in the fields. A ruler who forgets his people risks being forgotten by heaven. And so the shadow becomes not just condemnation but reminder that power is fragile, that neglect can weigh heavier than thunder, that dynasties fall not only to enemies at the gate, but to weaknesses at their heart. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift.